When I'm asked what I think about international development, the first thing that comes to mind, and without fail, are the programs that I would see when I was a kid, put on by groups like Save the Children and World Vision. And they showed the classic shots that I think are common to pretty much all middle-class Americans nowadays. The child with the swollen belly and the empty bowl. The mothers waiting with critically ill infants at clinics. People with limbs blown off because they happen to walk across a mine on their way to work. I think that it wasn't until later that I began to be able to ask some questions about these images and began to really round out at least my initial understanding of what was going on here in the developing world. Questions like how is it that in the United States we have a surplus of grain nearly every single year, yet there are still people who are starving in Burundi, for example. How is it that we can take organs from one person's body and put them successfully into another person's body, and yet the number one killer of children in the world is still something as simple as diarrhea? How is it that the Sahara Desert is expanding as it is? I remember as a child these programs specifically mentioning a drought and the Sahara Desert was expanding. And I thought as a kid, Sahara Desert's expanding. Well, I guess that's just what deserts do. Just like magic, they just expand, but they don't. Desertification is tied to land use issues, and land use issues are tied to poverty. And poverty is oftentimes tied to development schemes that are too heavily focused on the material gain of the donor nation or the donor multinational corporation. If you look at where U.S. aid is concentrated, you'll find that not coincidentally, it matches up with a map of markets that we are trying to break into or gain market share in. And I'm not saying that money is bad. I think it'd be naive to think that General Electric or a corporation like that would go into a developing nation, fund massive infrastructure rebuilds for nothing but love in return. I don't think that's going to happen. However, I do feel that if what underpins the entire practice of foreign aid is this post-World War II dream where no one goes hungry, children are healthy, there's prosperity for all, and most of all goodwill towards all, then I'd say that in many areas of the world today we're moving further away from this every year. So if we want lasting peace and prosperity, I think what we need to do is re-examine what we're doing here in relation to international development and investment. I think that at the very least we need to open up lines of communication and cooperation in the research and planning phases of development, and that the whole process needs to be more participatory, especially where the goal is to address the needs of the poorest of the poor. I remember when I started in the program at Humboldt, I remember in all the readings that I was doing for classes, what attracted me the most were the participatory schemes, the schemes like the Grameen Bank, which is tremendously successful, making small business loans, oftentimes less than $100, to people to start small businesses. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at something like that? What I think attracted me most about participant schemes was the focus on development of the human spirit, the personal empowerment. A little under a year later, I get a call from Bob White saying that there are grant funds available, and that these grant funds need to be spent in Africa, and would I like to do a project in Africa? And I said, would I like to do a project in Africa? I would love to do a project in Africa. And a little over a year later, I was in in South Africa working with an incredible group of women in a black township doing participant-guided development.
As far as I understand participatory research, basically it is something that originated in the third world, as it is called, or in developing countries. And I think the main initial forces came from South America and Asia and Indonesia. And why did it particularly come from there is because in third world countries or developing countries there is usually not that much money available for research. And the critique came that the research that was done often didn't really benefit national development. So if there's a scarcity of resources, then it's not so easy to just give research for esoteric topics. So from there came the push that if academics or researchers want to do research, it actually has to be something that is of benefit for the national development. Development as a concept has changed from being a mainly economic concept to being something that also involves human resources. So the whole idea of people-centered development and participatory research is a part of that people-centered development. So if we're going to contribute to national development, we also have to focus on the people.
When I got to South Africa in May 1993, I started looking for a project. And in my travels through South Africa looking for a project to participate in, I met Jean Murcott and Thandi Mlandu. It was with these two women that the participant-directed scheme that I'm going to be talking about developed. As I was passing through South Africa, Jean invited me back to Port Elizabeth the following month to go to a conference. It was a Women in Development conference that was hosted by the University of Port Elizabeth. And it was at this conference that she and I first became acquainted with Hildy van Vlaanderen. Hildy had a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge in working with participatory schemes in South Africa. It was through listening to Hildy's talk for the first time that I really kind of got a little briefing on what I could be expecting insofar as the psychological issues that played in participant-directed research specific to South Africa.
In third world countries or developing countries that became independent, the whole idea of democracy and the whole idea that people had a say in their country was important. So it also had the second influence that people wanted to be part or a controlling agent in the research. Because also research in the past had bad connotations, like it is the government that does research because with that information they're going to do something that is detrimental to us.
Jean very generously invited me to stay with her family to save a little money while I was kind of figuring out what I was going to do for a project. And Thandi was temporarily keeping house for Jean until she could get some sort of paid community development position. Community development and social welfare were really Thandi's passions, and she was a natural at them. It wasn't before long that Thandi let me know that there were two women by the name of Jennifer Boyle and Irene Walker who had approached her about sharing some gardening information with her. And setting up a garden was something that Thandi had already wanted to do. Thandi invited me to tag along to a meeting where Irene Walker was going to share some information about the gardening project that she had started in Grahamstown called Umtati. It seemed to be just the right connection at the right time. Gardening had been something that women in Walmer Township had already wanted to pursue, but they just didn't have the knowledge or the resource or the connection or the spark to get it going. Irene Walker and Umtati seemed to provide that spark I think that the information that we got from Hildy was very helpful in kind of navigating this a whole new experience.
So if we're going to contribute to national development, we also have to focus on the people. So out of that, of all these different influences or all these different things happening, came the idea of a participatory research, which is a kind of research that has three components. And the first component is that one collects data, one has to have information in order to move on, which is very close to the traditional type of research, is the getting of information.
After the initial meeting where Irene Walker came in and shared with the women information about Umtati, the women got together a second time, and at this second meeting they looked at what kind of resources they all had and decided what resources they wanted to pool together, how many shovels, how many rakes, how many spades. They looked at long-term and short-term goals for the project. They shared with each other what kinds of things they wanted to grow. Along with what resources they had, they also looked at what resources they needed. And a lot of them needed fences, and a lot of them wanted better access to water. Among the short-term goals, they wanted to grow food. They wanted to use that food to feed their family and also make a little bit of money for themselves.
But the two other aspects, the one of research is also an educational process, and thirdly, research leads to action, are more characteristics specific for participatory research.
My role on the project became one of a facilitator. I worked primarily with Tondi, helping her to achieve the goals that she had laid out for herself as project coordinator. Among those goals for Tondi were she wanted to learn how to type, and she wanted to learn how to go outside the township for resources. And of course, she also wanted to learn how to garden.
So participatory research is basically a strategy that involves 3 points, or that involves 3 prongs, which is collecting data, education, which means that the process of the collecting data is educational. It assists people. Before and after, people should be different. Afterwards, they should have more knowledge themselves, not the researcher, about what they research, but also they should have knowledge of the process. The next time people have a problem, or a community or a group has a problem, they've got skills to research that problem. They don't have to go back. So in fact, as a researcher, you're self-effacing. In the end, you shouldn't be needed.
Once the gardening project started to get rolling, and by rolling I mean the women were assessing their own resources and assessing what they needed, and Tondi was learning how to use the computer, and she and I were discussing where outside the township resources existed that could help the group. At this point, I thought that it would be good for me to go out and kind of get an idea of what types of development had gone on in Walmer Township previously and what development was going on presently. And I started seeking out some people who could give me some information. And what I was told over and over and over was something that I didn't fully understand at the time. I was told that Walmer Township was a dependent community. By dependent, that meant that that they were accustomed to receiving things. This, I was told, had the effect of making people less likely to actively participate in programs that go in to help and train. I was given the example of one project that went into Walmer Township that was run by the Ladies Benevolent Society. And what these ladies did was they took vouchers for the local grocery store, and they gave them away in the township. And apparently what was happening was numerous individuals would go and get these vouchers, and then they'd take these vouchers to the shebeen in the township and trade the voucher for alcohol. And so the word that I heard time and time again was dependent community. And while I certainly knew what dependency was, I know that I didn't fully understand what kind of implications that would have for a project, and I didn't fully understand what that meant to me personally. What I did know was that I had been invited to help, and I wanted to help, and that was exactly what I was going to try to do.
Okay, so the educational aspect is again two-pronged. The one is, once we've collected data on, let's say, our housing condition, we've got that data, and we know where it comes from. So it is something that we understand because we know the process we went to, and we've learned the process, so we can use it in a different situation. All right, and then the third one is basically action. And that action relates into what Fredrik calls the whole kind of circle of action reflection. Now, if one collects data on the housing situation, you find out that this and this and this is needed. You go into the action, all right? Now, let's say you build 20 houses. Then you reflect on that and you say, well, we've got to 20 houses. How has it changed our situation? And out of that reflection, you actually start a new participatory process, or you start a new process. You have to collect new data because actually research is never ending. Participatory research is never ending. It's basically almost a way of life of a community. Problems arise, they will always arise, or issues arise. What do we do together? We set up a strategy to collect data. We collect data. What do we do with that data? We basically try and execute an action. But an action is never a finite thing. So you reflect on that and you go back to collecting data and so on.
The project really began to pick up some steam. Resources just came pouring in when Tandi would go and request them. We put our heads together to determine where these resources were, and Tandi would just go and get them. She was tremendously successful. She got dozens of trees donated from the Port Elizabeth municipality, courtesy of Jennifer Boyle. She got hundreds of seed packets. I remember her children counting these seed packets and for inventory. There came a point when the inventory became so large, there were trees and seeds and cabbage plants, that that I showed her how to make a kind of a rudimentary ledger, so to speak, just so she could get an idea of how much inventory she had, and when she did distribute to one of the women in the project, she could put their name and how many plants received and when and what date, so that if in the future there were funding to be had, she would have something on paper that would show the history of the project and how many people the project was actually reaching. Insofar as human resources and informational resources outside the township, the project already had the Umtati project in Grahamstown, and they were a tremendous source of information and just moral support. Locally, we identified another permaculturalist who actually was a contact that came through Jean Murcott and her husband. Kim Tucker was a South African woman who had a permaculture farm not 5 or 6 miles from the township, so she was a local resource that could be used. And what was an extra bonus was that Kim Tucker actually had experience in doing permaculture in that area, which was a kind of a difficult area depending on what kind of soil you happen to have on your plot. Much of the township had sand dune underneath it. Kim Tucker had real experience and real good advice as to how to manage and how to do permaculture in the difficult soil that was found in the township. Kim Tucker also had no qualms about going into the township, which at that point in South African history, you wouldn't find many white South Africans that would go into a township. And so that was a real asset for the project. Now, while to some extent these contacts that Tandi was making were set up in that they were friends of friends, she was entirely responsible for getting the resource, for approaching the person, approaching the group. And we worked together to develop skills in interviewing, to go in centered and knowing what it was you were there for and what it was this person could possibly help you with. Tandi wanted her appearance to be professional, and she wanted to be taken seriously by people that she went to for resources. And we worked on that. We worked on how to present yourself, how to, for example, arrive early, what to bring with you, what to have in your head as questions that you wanted to ask this person. Once Tandi simply had this information, she worked with it very naturally. There was one time when Jennifer Boyle and I and Tandi went out to see this man who had a commercial mushroom farm on the outskirts of town. And this man had mushroom compost that was a waste product from his process that the women in the township could use to amend their soil. While we accompanied Tandi to see this man, the negotiation was all Tandi. And she did it in grand style. She managed to not only get the compost, but also arrange for the man to deliver it to the township, which was very convenient because the project had no actual trucks or transportation. Tandi also contacted the small business unit at University of Port Elizabeth, and this was really significant because we had no contact with the small business unit. There was no friend of a friend there. It was entirely her energy that went and sought out this resource. And she sought out this resource to provide some sort of assistance, some sort of education, should the women actually bump up their selling of the vegetables to the level of a small business.
If one looks at the principles that are underlying participatory research, then I would say, again, if you read the academic literature or even the literature of what people who call themselves development activists, what they write about participatory research is very varied. I mean, it is kind of, if you would read two kind of extreme papers, you wouldn't think it's talking about the same issue, participatory research. So I think if you become a participatory researcher and if you work with a group or with a community, or if you're involved in practice, you will start developing your own blend of participatory research that's basically suits your personality, and that suits the culture that you're working with, and that even suits the donor you might be working with, because they also have all got an influence. But you develop your own blend, because one thing that's very important in participatory research is the participatory researcher or the animator or facilitator, what is called, who that person is. Because as you're going to become only one actor in a process, rather than being the one that controls the research question, the research process and your subjects, if you put yourself basically on the line and said, look, we are a group, I'm only one particular person in that group doing the research with specific skills, but also acknowledging that the rest of the people will also bring skills that you don't have, you're actually moving away from controlling it. Now, if you're in a situation that you're not controlling, you as an individual become much more important. You as a personality become much more important. You can't control it, so people will take you on what you say. They'll feel they can critique you, or they also feel they can ask you things. So it can be quite stressful.
The interpersonal relationships among us on the project, I think, really gave the flavor to what was going on here. I remember my first experiences with Jean. After the women's conference where we met Hildy, I remember standing in line with Jean for the ladies' room. And of course, since it was a women's conference, the line was out the door. I mean, there must have been 20, 25 women in line. And I noticed that there's no one in the men's room. And so I nudged Jean, and I'm all, Jean, there's nobody in the men's room. And without going into any more detail, there were 2 women that day that didn't wait in any line to use the restroom. That was when I knew I was going to be staying in Port Elizabeth, and I knew I was going to be working with Jean. Jean was a very dedicated, very professional development worker and community activist. She organized focus group meetings from which the information contributed to establishing the groundwork for the new Bill of Rights and the new Constitution in South Africa. She was an ordained minister. She worked within the East Cape Council of Churches to establish a Women in Development office within the Council of Churches. She saw that women in South Africa were really an under-recognized force in the move to democracy and justice. And she saw the need for more attention to be dedicated to women's projects. So Jean came up with the idea for the position of a women's project coordinator under the Council of Churches. And she designed this position, she pitched this position, and she got this position. And she was very, very dedicated and effective in it. I think that Jean and I really inspired each other, and I think that we also brought out kind of a playful side in each other as well. And when times weren't so good, I think that we kind of got on each other's nerves, and we didn't exactly know what to do about that, because it was obvious that we had a tremendous amount of respect for each other. And I think that things like that are going to happen. Tondi as well had a long list of accomplishments previous to being involved in this project. She'd been a rape crisis counselor. She'd been organizing voter education drives. She was the primary welfare distributor for her township, and she and her husband were very involved in the town council. I remember one time after the project started to get going, and Tondi was designing this questionnaire so that she could keep track of information that the women were giving her about themselves and about their gardens and about what they needed and wanted. And I remember looking at this questionnaire, and I recommended a question. And she gave me this look like, you know, I could tell that a relationship was developing where she could question me. When she would question me like that or give me a look, that's when I felt that Tondi had really taken ownership, so to speak, of her part in the project.
I think one cannot do participatory research with a problem or a research question that did not originate in the group of people you're going to be doing research with. So if I'm coming to a group and I'm saying, I've got this research question here that really interests me, would you like to cooperate? I'm not saying you won't get cooperation, but it'd be very difficult because it is not something that is close to people's heart. I mean, what's close to people's heart is something that people talk about all the time when they sit in the local ANC office, or when they, I'm not thinking of a different setting, if they're all together at a mill somewhere where people get together and where they talk or where they get emotional about. If you just sit down and you listen to people having a conversation, something they talk loud about, excited, that's the kind of thing you can do participatory research on, because you do need commitment. If you don't have commitment of the people, even as a facilitator, you can be really committed, it's not going to work. So it's got to be problem-centered, something that they want. Secondly, it is very important that people, the group you're working with, is involved throughout the whole process. Now that's also very difficult if you come in as a trained researcher, because you know what all the steps are, and if you work with the community and you basically facilitate and give your skills to them for them to use it, it's a very slow process. And at times you come back to your office and you just say, let me quickly write it up and bring it back. Once you've done that, you've taken a step that you've lost them. So your mind has gone further, and you might not even realize that you've taken a hop that they didn't take. So you come up with something that is now new, that hasn't been jointly discussed. Now I'm not saying that you can never do anything, but it has to be something. If, let's say, you work on something together and at the end of the day you haven't finished everything and you get delegated to do certain things, that's a different thing. But I'm talking more of the different steps. You move from step to step, and some steps you're leaving people out. So it's very important to be there from the problem identification to the results of your first cycle, because I said the cycles always go on, to that which is the end of your action and basically an evaluation of your action.
Memories come rushing up to meet me now, but in the space between the heavens and the corner of some far field, I had a dream.
I think the beauty of this project is that it used a strategy that was already familiar to the women. They were already accustomed to gathering and talking about their problems, and so the process was one that they trusted. I know without a doubt that Tondi was the strength of the project. Tandy had a tremendous desire to improve herself and to improve herself for her community. And when you have someone like that, someone that is so guided at the center of an action, everyone in the group is going to feel the benefit from it. I think intuitively I was strong in what I helped Tandy and the women to accomplish. I also think that there was a lot of energy coming at the project and coming at me. And while a lot of this energy was helpful, some of it was not so helpful. And at the time, I really had limited experience in working to assess the quality of this energy that was coming at me. And if it wasn't so helpful to deflect it and direct it in a more positive, constructive way. When you become someone that people are counting on, the pressure is tremendous. And I think that this aspect of my experience there had its roots more in the dependent nature of the township than in the participatory process that was going on. Within the participatory structure, I was just another person. I was just equal to them. I may have had some knowledge, but my role was no larger than anyone else's. However, I think the township was accustomed to a style of development that was more directed towards giving things. I think everyone in South Africa had this expectation of big money coming from the first world, and big money in particular coming from America. And I think when I got there, I was possibly their own little chunk of America. And when the money didn't just fall from the sky, I guess around me, I think there was a little disappointment. I think that a lot of people outside the project were critical that it wasn't really a project if it didn't have a substantial amount of funding, or any funding at all, actually. However, I think one benefit of this, and I don't think that the women really saw this as a benefit, but not having a large amount of funding and not having a high-profile project, we were able to fly below the radar, so to speak, of individuals in the township that would attach themselves in a dependent fashion to projects that would come in. And I think that other people were also skeptical that it wasn't really a project if I myself was not out there digging holes and digging gardens. By far, the best thing about this project was that these women got together with no World Bank, with no IMF, no Monsanto, no General Electric. They got together using strategies that they had been using all along, and in a matter of less than 5 months, improved their family's nutrition.
Take heed.